God allowing suffering in the world is a major and unavoidable part of every conversation between an atheist and a person of faith, regardless of what religion they follow. The reason God allows and or created suffering is an inherently pointless argument to make. The argument is as futile as debating why God created the moon or made light. If we live in an existence created by a supreme deity, nothing we say or do can change that. A person believing or not believing in a deity that may or may not exist has no effect whatsoever on that deity existing or not existing. But the only thing we know for sure is that the argument exists. So here is why God allows suffering to exist. For starters, atheists do not believe in an afterlife. The existence of suffering in the presence of an all-present, all-seeing, all-powerful, and all-loving deity seems to be illogical at the very least to them. But for most religions, this life is a testing phase for an afterlife. So while this doesn't justify why there is suffering, it is important for creating context. Life as we know it lasts a dozen decades or less. The afterlife, on the other hand, is often described as infinite. So from a perfectly logical perspective, a life with suffering, even a life of nothing but suffering, is essentially irrelevant when compared to an eternity of literally unimaginable amounts of bliss. While this is an extreme way to justify why God would allow for suffering, when specifically talking about suffering from a religious perspective, there are other reasons specific to many religions that allow for suffering. Seeing as how most religions view this life as an evaluation, the suffering of one person is a test for another person to exert generosity, empathy, or a whole slew of other actions that can bring rewards from God. Some religions go a step further, where a punishment in this life is used in place of punishment in the afterlife, or to gain further reward in the afterlife. So in these traditions, suffering in some ways is essential to existence. On a slight tangent, suffering may be the result of God not interfering at all, as is described in the deist philosophy. The philosophy of deism postulates that God is much like a watchmaker, and that he created this existence and just lets it run its course and only tinkers with things occasionally. If we use the Bible as an example, the Bible is essentially chronological and spans multiple millennia. So even though the Bible is a large book, the times God intervenes over those thousands of years ends up being very sporadic, to say the least. The same line of reasoning can be used with other religious traditions, some that span even longer periods of time, and consistent through all of them is that God's intervention is sparse. So while deism is in direct conflict with many religious concepts that portray God as an active part of our daily lives, through deism, suffering is a direct result of how God created a system, but he doesn't intervene all that often. Now if we jump over to the atheist perspective and literally play the devil's advocate, Karl Marx called religion the opiate of the masses, and as such, religion is a tool to control people. With suffering by definition being a horrible circumstance, religion can be seen as a tool to cope with suffering and in some ways justify why it happens. This justification can allow people in power or people that directly cause suffering to bear less of a blame. So suffering can be seen as a mechanism that actually maintains and promotes faith. So while there are numerous religious traditions and philosophies, I hope this video opened up and in some ways justified why suffering may exist, even in the presence of an all-knowing and all-powerful deity. Until next time, I'm Jim Hoos, that's a fact, Jack, and you can take it to the bank.